Then coming to the medieval age. There, of course, the problem is the characterization of the Islamic invasions. Initially, this was not controversial at all. You know, even R.C. Majumdar in the 50s described these invasions as invasions, which is what they were. They were, to use a modern word, colonization. And in a sense, they were in fact more colonization than British colonialism. For example, very few of the Muslim rulers of India spoke an Indian language. They didn't care. The Mughal court language was Persian. And mind you, the first Mughal rulers had to learn a foreign language because they originally spoke Turkish. But you see, at that time, in their world in Central Asia, the language of civilization was Persian. So they adopted Persian. They did not adopt Hindi or Sanskrit, as they could have done. They chose to remain foreign, to feel like foreigners in India. By contrast, if you wanted to work for the British in India, in England itself you had to take a course of what they called Hindustani, Hindi Urdu, and become proficient, pass the examinations in England itself, and only then could you come to India. So in that sense, the British were far more integrated in India than the Muslims. Take also marriage. Many British employees of the East India Company married natives. And very often that meant that they adapted to the native culture, that they raised their children as Hindus or as Muslims, that they wore Indian dress and so on. Whereas the Muslims who came here, they would never marry, they would marry a native, but not as a Hindu. If she converted, they would accept her. You know, and the case of Akbar, who reputedly allowed one of his wives to worship Krishna, even inside the harem, if true, it is at any rate an exception. You see, Hindus were not accepted by Muslims. Muslims did not adapt to Hindu culture. Hindus were only accepted to the extent that they converted to Islam. So you see, Islam tried to impose their own culture, at least on their own world, if not on all of India. They did not adapt to the country they found. But of course, it is true that mostly Muslim rulers who had their homeland in Central Asia lost their homeland. And that is why they became Indian to some extent. And often they used a lot of resources that Indians produced, that they collected through taxes, in order to finance military campaigns into Central Asia to reconquer their homeland. So they were very much conscious of being colonizers from a foreign homeland. So, you know, decolonizers among us, please remain aware that the first colonization was not British, it was Muslim. Then the atrocities of Muslims, well, they should not be exaggerated. Like, for instance, it is said that 80 million Hindus have been killed by Muslims. That figure comes from the historian K.S. Lal, and what he uses to arrive at that is not descriptions by Muslims of the massacres they committed. There are such descriptions, because Muslims were not shy about that. They did not like to propagate that we are the religion of peace. No. They very much described and were proud of their own conquests and their own massacres. But that's not the source that K.S. Lal used. He used the demographic estimates for what they are worth to notice that the Indian population by 1525 should have been 80 to 100 million individuals, higher than what it was, based on the figures from the year 1000. Now, a historian should ask, what are these estimates for that period worth? That is one question you can ask. But at any rate, it doesn't say that these 80 to 100 million have been massacred. You have, for instance, the famines, just like under the British, that Muslim taxation caused, or Muslim disruption by war and so on, disruption of the agricultural system, and that caused people to die. So if people go missing in the demographic figures, it doesn't mean they have been killed. You have also the descriptions of the massacres. They don't add up to 80 million, but they do add up to very many. And then on the other hand, many massacres have not been described, or the descriptions have been lost. So the massacre may be estimated to have been more. But at any rate, it was not a peaceful affair. And Hindus were discriminated against. Hinduism very much was discriminated against. Hindu temples were destroyed. There are very many physical witnesses to that, namely destroyed temples. So that should be told truthfully. And that used to be told truthfully. Now, a big school in India claims it as decolonization, that they deny all this. And the one argument they use for it is the translation of a wealth of Muslim sources by Eliot and Dawson, where they give the history of India from its own sources, meaning the history of the Muslim period, as described by Muslim historians. So that is not a very nice thing, But he doesn't translate all those works completely. He gives the passages that are apt, and that, and this is where a certain bias comes in, that serve the British goal of showing the Hindus that they are better off under the British than under Muslim rule. Now, this is true. He is being selective. However, that does not mean that any of the translations are wrong. You see, I have heard very many Marxist historians in India claim, Eliot and Dawson were biased, you should not use this as a source. Well, maybe they were biased in the sense that they had a conviction. There are communist historians and anti-communist historians and so on. That doesn't mean they manipulate the facts. So I've never heard one of those point to one specific translation that is wrong, that should have been different. So as translations go, the translation that Eliot and Dawson give is fairly correct. And so the estimate of people killed that they give is also correct, to the extent that the chroniclers themselves gave correct figures. Now here, of course, sometimes they give them too low, sometimes they give them too high. And this is precisely because of a also rather unflattering reason, namely because they thought killing was a great and virtuous thing, and that therefore they praised the king who employed them, they praised the king, they extolled him by giving a high estimate of the massacres he caused. So, these figures, they will never be known exactly, but, there are different aspects to them, to estimate them in a historically justifiable way. So that should be done. And the modern bias of excluding the unpleasant data, you see, that should be over. That was a form of decolonization that really is not so commendable.